When I was in the newsroom, that is when I also got an opportunity to be selected to go and represent Kenya as a press attaché in Brussels. It was a reward for the great work we had done in the newsroom, and it was visible. People felt that change, and some of the colleagues we were with in the newsroom at the time, William Meda, he went to New York in our embassy on the mission to the UN. I remember Harry Njoroge, one of my colleagues, they went on foreign service, and it was a time of great expectations and great changes in the ministry. In terms of quality of people, there were opportunities for further training. People were coming in, graduates now, and the KNA became quite something for the entire media industry because we were central in covering this country. But then working in the foreign service was another. That was very, very challenging. What do you do if you are a press attaché in an embassy? Yeah, you may go there, and if you are not creative, you probably may end up like a messenger around there, because we were outsiders. We are not foreign service officers as such, and we were not even trained. You went there completely untrained. So if you are not creative, you would not survive. What were your activities now? Mine was to report things that were relevant to us. Kenyan connection with the European Economic Community, which is European Union now. I would look out for those things that connect us and how they promote our interest in terms of trade, tourism, education, exchange programs for students, social groups, women, youth, politicians. We prepared programs that the European people came, and our people also came up there, fully sponsored trips. I got some of our officers from our ministry and from the private media to come there and to have a tour of about 3 weeks. And it was a very exciting thing. And how do you find your way as a journalist at the same time you are a diplomat? In fact, in the beginning, when the Belgian government saw that I was a journalist in my passport, they refused to allow me as a staff of the embassy, as a diplomat. And that thing had to be changed to read civil servant, because a journalist is not a diplomat. We argued and lost, so we had to change my passport. Very interesting things. But that did not cow us at all, and I had wonderful ambassadors. I worked first with Ambassador Nyaga, who now became a politician. I worked, he was the ambassador I found in Brussels when I went there in '85, and then he left to become head of Kenya Airways. Francis Mutaura, who became head of civil service, he came after Nyaga to be our ambassador. He was a career officer in the government service. That was a wonderful experience because he had worked in Kenya in provincial administration. He had worked even in our embassies in the US. He had a great wealth of experience, and he was a marvelous man to help you along the way in whatever situations arose. And we were able to do fantastic things, promoting Kenya. We go hold Kenya Days in provincial headquarters in Belgium. And that was quite interesting because here was a person with whom you think alike as civil servant, and that was a very exciting time. We did a lot of work. Yes.
There were two methods of receiving news from the field. There was the telex, and then there was the radio call machine, which was manned by somebody on a permanent basis, but also through shifts. But also the reporters would also man the radio call. And very urgent stories came through the radio call, and you had to be sure you are getting the other person correctly. It wasn't very clear. It was taxing, and yet the greatest responsibility was placed on you. Because if you got the facts wrongly, it goes on air. KNA was still the source, the only source for KBC news, the only source for news for radio and television for the country. So it was really quite a major responsibility. And yet the radio call was servicing regions in the country that were not accessible in any other way. So, and that's where a lot of stories would blow up, would explode, and therefore it was really useful.
We even used postage. You post news. There are certain news that were not urgent, but they are developmental. You would send them by post. We would send news by telephone from Lamu, from Samburu. You send them by telephone, but the telephone was subject to breakdown too frequently. Sometimes I would use even people like, pilots flying into Lamu, bringing tourists to Nairobi. I would give them news to bring to Nairobi for me, and they were very kind. They did that. And then at the provincial level was the teleprinter service, centered in Nairobi. The network was available in all the provincial headquarters. So that would help, because if you make telephone calls to transmit the news, you are sending it at a shorter distance so that it is not eating into your telephone allocation and finishing your money.
Over time, KNA has remained really the bulk of news service for KBC.
Like when I was a very young reporter, a few months after I was employed in '69, in 1970, there was non-aligned conference in Lusaka, Zambia. And Nairobi was the connection point to this world conference. And I was very young, from school, but based at KNA headquarters, I was covering delegates coming through Nairobi, Embakasi Airport, going south. And I interviewed even the King of Nepal, the Prime Minister of Guyana, the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi. I interviewed a lot of African heads of state and foreign dignitaries passing through that. And I was young and out of school, but I think what we learn in school, which sometimes we never actually realize we can use. My geography, my history, those things became very effective because I knew where this king has come from. Not many people knew Nepal. I remember one time when I interviewed this king of Nepal, Attorney General Charles Njonjo asked me, how the hell did you remember that Nepal is somewhere on the globe? I couldn't even figure out quickly where it is. How did you get it just right and you know it? I said, we did the geography of the Himalayas. And that made me know where things are and countries are in the world atlas. And I was able now to link that. And it was a very exciting experience for me as a young reporter.
I was chasing a story when Mr. Matiba was a minister for housing. The government was coming up with a very radical housing arrangement, national policy. And I was chasing a story. That time I was also at KBC. So I was chasing it as a story and also as material for news commentary. Of course, Mr. Matiba thought that is not how things work in government. We should wait until he explains it, he publishes it and things, he launches it. And I tried to insist, and he actually called security for me, and I was thrown out. And then he was traveling to Mombasa as well. Then I found my way back and went to talk to the director of housing. The director of housing gave me the whole story about it. And as I went back to KBC, I found Cornelius Nyamboki, the director, he actually called me when I arrived, and he said Mr. Matiba had just called him. And he was expressing his disappointment at the way I was operating. But then he said in 2 weeks' time, he promises that he will give me an interview as I had desired. Then I told Mr. Nyamboki, but what I had gone to collect, I already got from the director of housing, and he was very free to give me. Then Mr. Nyamboki said, go ahead with it. And
when I was serving in Garissa, I had got an opportunity to go abroad to Central Office of Information in London, and I had a passport already. But since I was far away from Nairobi, I was replaced by somebody quietly. So corruption started a long time. I'm still holding that passport. I've never used it. That is a nasty story that I sometimes remember when I see that passport.
Stories to do with economics and development have been interesting to me. And then also there are social areas where you see things that could be stopped, and yet they are happening. So one of the, especially when I was in Mombasa, one of the key person I constantly visited was the provincial planning officer. They seemed to have a tap on what is happening in the province, and they also had information which wasn't in public domain, and yet were key catalysts for how the country would move. So I used to look at what the person was saying, the information they were giving, and then, of course, step it down to an interesting story. Mombasa is an interesting place, so even the social features were really something that attracted me. Yeah. It's important to mention the link between KBC Newsroom and the Kenya News Agency. In the past, that was one team. It was one team. In fact, in KBC, we had the very strange situation where we were under two directors. For us, we were directly under the Director of Information. And yet, because of day-to-day operations, we were under the Director of Broadcasting. But our promotions, the person who kept an interest in news was the Director of Information. We were his children, but now operating at KBC. So even the promotions then I would get at KBC were information positions, all through. While administratively they would call you are an assistant editor, you are now an editor, you are a news supervisor. I ended up at KBC as the head of television news, which I did for a number of years. But even that time, my substantive position was really an information officer. So that time I had gotten to assistant director of information as I was doing that.